Welcome to EMS Auditing Basics. You're now ISO 14001 gurus, and I mean that. You know more about the ISO 14001 standard than 99% of the people at your facility and anybody that you're going to be auditing. So it's going to be very important for you to project that confidence as an auditor. So why perform audits? The process of auditing is a risk management activity. So whether we're doing financial audits, quality, health and safety, or environmental audits, we're trying to manage some type of risk. So what are the types of risks that we're trying to manage with an environmental audit? Well, first of all, we're trying to prevent any non-conformances during our registration audit. Most of our plant managers don't like those. Whether it's a minor or major, our goal is to try to detect those issues before the registration company shows up. We could detect legal non-compliance issues, which could minimize fines. We could detect issues that could increase costs. So things like improper recycling, excessive leaks or spills, those types of things can increase cost. Or we could not be prepared in the event of an emergency. Whether we had a fire, a spill, or other type of an emergency, we could be ill-prepared. And lastly, audits are a major input into our continual improvement process. Depending on the type of audit that we're doing, we're going to be comparing our activities against a specific audit criteria. So for a financial or accounting audit, we may be comparing ourselves to the generally accepted accounting principles. If we're doing a quality audit, we could be comparing ourselves against the TS 16949 standard. Environmental audits could be against the ISO 14001 standard or regulations. And health and safety audits could also be audited against a management system standard, which is ISO 45001 or an OSHA regulation. So the definition of an environmental audit is a systemic, independent, and documented process for obtaining audit evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the EMS criteria are being fulfilled. So again, there are various types of audits we can do. We can do environmental management system audits, quality management system audits, and environmental compliance audits. Each of these types of audits have different objectives, criteria, and require different qualifications for who can conduct these types of audits. There are two words that sound alike and often get used interchangeably, the words compliance and conformance. But if we can separate those words and use them in clearly the right context, it helps out a lot. So there's two types of audits. There's an environmental compliance audit, which checks our emission limits, our manifesting, chemical storage, and permitting requirements, and we're checking those against a state or a federal regulation. Versus the types of audits that you guys will do, we'll call those environmental conformance audits. And this is where you're trying to validate that we're conforming to our procedures and our work instructions. And if we can, again, use those terms very consistently, you are a conformance auditor, and typically your corporate or consultants come in and help do the compliance evaluations. You may hear the terminology first-party audit, second-party audit, or third-party audit. As internal auditors, you guys are doing first-party audits. You're auditing your own system or process. A third-party auditor is somebody that is not associated with your organization, comes in and does an independent third-party assessment of your activity. And second-party audits are typically what we call audits when either we go out and audit a supplier or our customer comes in and audits us. They've got some involvement with the system, and so they're not totally independent of it, but they are coming in to assess our program to fit their needs. Registration audits are conducted by a third-party accredited registration company. They will typically come into a facility once a year to validate that they conform to the standard that they're certified, and they are the company that issues the certification. ISO 19011 is a guideline for conducting management system audits. Now, this guideline is not anything that you are certified to. You're not required to follow its requirements. But I do like for internal auditors to be aware that there is this ISO guidance document out there that kind of describes the basic concepts of auditing. ISO 19011 is broken up into 7 different clauses. The first clause is much like ISO 14000, or some general information and definitions. And the real meat of the guidance document starts at Section 4, Auditing Principles. Section 5 gets into how to manage an audit program. Section 6 talks about how to perform an audit. And Section 7 talks about what is it that makes an auditor competent, and how to assess auditor competency. Section 4 talks about the 5 principles of auditing. It says auditors should be ethical, fair, and professional, and the audit approach needs to be independent and an evidence-based approach to the program. So let's talk a minute about how to set up an internal audit program. Both the ISO 14001 standard at Section 9.2 and ISO 19011 talk about the basics of setting up an ISO 14001 internal audit program. So the ISO 14001 standard at Section 9.2 talks about the requirements for an internal audit program. It says the company shall establish an internal audit program to assess whether their EMS is being implemented and maintained. So again here, the key thing here for an internal audit is to look at the organization's own requirements, which are basically your procedures, your work instructions, your processes. And then it says, and the international standard. So obviously you can always fall back on the standard itself. But the internal audit really is primarily to evaluate whether your procedures are being followed and implemented. It says the audit program shall define the frequency, the method, and the planning for the internal audits. That the frequency shall be based on the environmental importance of the activity and the results of previous audits. So there may be some activities, we'll say recycling. If we recycle every day of the year, does it make sense that we would only audit our recycling program one time a year? And if we've had previous audit results where there have been problems in areas, maybe those would be areas that we would audit more frequently. The program shall define the planned intervals or a schedule, the audit criteria to be used, and how the audits will be documented. So you'll notice you don't see the words here, you must audit every element every year. It just says you have to set up a program that can evaluate your effectiveness and have a planned interval or schedule. The other key thing is that auditors must be objective and impartial. So what that means is you cannot audit your own work, and the results of the audits must be reported to management. Again, when you're establishing an internal audit program, the goal of the audit program is to improve over time. So there's a planning element in audits. We're going to do the audits, we're going to check on them, and then we should review the program at some frequency and go back and determine how can we improve our audit process. So again, when you're managing an audit program, it's an audit program for carrying out a series of activities. These can be process audits, element audits, but again, the schedule should be comprehensive in that it can validate the effectiveness of your entire program. We should have some resources allocated, which is why you're here. Resources being trained, define their responsibilities, set up a schedule, and then have some type of a process to review the audits over time and hopefully be able to improve our program. The competency or training requirements for internal auditors is not established in the ISO 14000 standard. If you look at ISO 19011 section 7, it does talk about some general qualities and qualifications for auditing. But an internal auditor, again, just needs to be competent both in the standard and have some experience with the facility to be an effective auditor. Again, audit frequency, we should try to hit over the course of the audit program in all of our departments. If we're operating on 3 shifts, we should try to conduct some auditing on each of our shifts. And then the frequency can again then be based on the environmental importance of the activity, how we performed in previous audit results, if there have been any changes to the facility or processes. Those may be things that we want to audit more frequently for a while. So here's an example of what could be an internal audit program. These guys have split their audits up on a quarterly basis. It looks like they're doing one annual, what they call system audit per year, and touching on all the system issues in the manual. They're looking at their communication and general awareness of their employees. And they're doing that twice a year. They're looking at recycling, and they're evaluating the recycling procedure and program once a quarter, and it says on all 3 shifts. These folks have some what they call hazardous and universal waste, and again, they're doing a quarterly audit of these areas to validate probably the labeling and storage and paperwork associated with those things. And then on an annual basis, they're auditing their emergency response process. So they're auditing the plan, they're making sure that it's current, they're verifying that drills are being completed and that the current contact information is represented in those plans. So in summary, your audit program or plan does not need to be based on auditing every element every year. You could look at a 2 or 3 year cycle. Obviously, some things you'll need to look at every year. Other things you may choose to look at, again, once every 3 years, just depending on them. You should map all of your requirements and processes. So all of your procedures and work instructions over that cycle should be audited at least one time during the program to validate that it's being implemented effectively. And again, you want to ensure that the audits verify specific requirements and requirements associated with the international standard. When establishing an audit program, it's very helpful to have templates and tools set up so that the auditors have a very consistent format of both checking the system and then documenting their results. So to have a template for an audit schedule, preparing an audit plan, your audit checklist, and maybe an audit summary report would be very helpful. But again, the goal is to help ensure that these audits are done consistently and documented well, year after year. This particular graphic came out of the 19011 document section 7. It's just kind of a graphical representation of auditor skills and competencies and abilities. So at a minimum, you need some competency in the standard that you're auditing to. You need some general auditing skills. You want somebody that's had the appropriate education, work experience, and then some audit experience. So you don't want to put a brand new trained auditor on his first audit by himself. He needs to work with an experienced auditor. And then you also want to work on selecting people that have the right personal attributes. Some people make good auditors, some don't. So be careful as you're selecting your auditors. A few of the attributes that may make somebody a good auditor would be somebody who's knowledgeable, impartial, organized, persistent, objective, diplomatic, and unemotional. We don't have to get mad during the auditing process. And these would be some typical attributes that would make somebody a good auditor. So the internal auditing process consists of these 8 basic steps. Step 1, you'll receive an audit assignment. This is where you're given the area that you'll be auditing, whether it's a certain element, whether it's a certain set of procedures, but you'll be given the initial assignment. Next step is you're going to take that assignment and review all of the referenced EMS documentation associated with your audit. Then if you're given a checklist, you're going to review that checklist, or you'll make up your own checklist. What is it that I'm going to check? And then you want to develop a plan. And whether this is a formal written audit plan or just you sketching out on the back of a piece of paper how you plan to conduct the audit, you need to plan out the audit in your own mind. The next step, step 5, will be to conduct an opening meeting. This will either be a bigger, larger formal meeting with a group of auditors and management, or it could be just you and the management representative reviewing your audit plan, the thing that you've been assigned to audit, and verifying that they are in agreement with your approach to the audit. It's very important to do that prior to starting the audit itself. Step 6, you're going to execute the audit. You're going to go out and collect the evidence. You're going to compare it against the audit criteria, and you're going to make findings of either conformance or non-conformance. Once you're done or through the process, you're going to document your audit with good notes. If you have findings of non-conformance, you're going to document those properly. And then you're going to get together for a closing meeting to review the audit itself and any findings that you have. So again, once you've started the audit, you're going to collect the evidence, and there's 3 basic types of evidence. Records, we're going to review. We're going to go out and make observations. We're going to watch people work. We're going to check storage of things. We're going to look at labeling. And then lastly, we're going to interview people to assess their awareness of their responsibilities and requirements. We will compare that evidence to our procedures, and we will make a finding of either in conformance or non-conformance. So the basic definition of a non-conformance in the standard is the non-fulfillment of a requirement. And we're going to talk about this significantly over the next few lessons, and it's really important that we just kind of decide what we're going to consider to be a nonconformity versus what might be just a minor issue that doesn't need to get written up. The ISO standard also defines a requirement as a need or expectation that is stated or generally implied or obligatory. So whether it's written in a work instruction, or we know that this is the way it's supposed to be, or this is something that we know that our organization expects, that again becomes a requirement. And once we audit something and we find that there is something not being fulfilled, that is how we identify a potential nonconformity. So to prove a nonconformance, you also have to clearly state and identify what the requirement is. Okay, so what's our next step here? Once our audit program is established, it's time to get out and do some auditing. So in our next session, we're going to get into some auditing. We're going to look at some procedures and work instructions. We're going to talk about how to collect evidence, how to make findings. We're going to go through some case studies to give you some experience evaluating both procedures and the standard, and give you some idea how you as an internal auditor will begin executing the audits. See you next time. Okay, well, we'll see you in a few days to complete our second module of training, EMS auditing. But again, if you have any questions either today or throughout the entire course or even afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me either via email or text. You can try to call me, but I'm oftentimes busy during the day. So, but I do try to be responsive and want to help people to become the best auditors that they can become.